for generations. 70. The Ku Klux Klan relied on fear to maintain control, using intimidation, threats, and public displays of hatred to silence black communities across the United States. Their power did not come from strength alone, but from the belief that no one would dare to resist, that the law would look the other way, that silence was safer than standing up. But history tells a deeper, often ignored story. When protection failed and justice was absent, many black men refused to surrender their families, their homes, or their dignity. They organized. So, they stood watch. They made a choice that would quietly reshape the balance of fear. These were not reckless acts, nor were they about revenge. They were acts of survival, measured, disciplined, and rooted in the simple belief that life was worth defending. This story is not about chaos. It is about courage. It is about men who understood that progress does not move forward on hope alone. It also requires resolve. From small southern towns to tense post-war cities, these individuals and communities drew a line and held it. And in doing so, they forced an organization built on intimidation to hesitate, retreat, and sometimes disappear entirely. You will not always find these stories in textbooks. They were rarely celebrated, often misunderstood, and sometimes deliberately erased. Yet their impact was real. They protected neighborhoods. They changed court outcomes. They created space for future movements to breathe and grow. In this video, we will uncover the stories of black men who made the Klan feel something it had inflicted on others for generations. Consequence. These are stories of strategy, restraint, and unbreakable will, stories that challenge the idea that history only moves one way. If you believe these stories matter, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who values truth that goes beyond the surface. Because remembering is an act of resistance. Some stories were never meant to be forgotten. At the close of the 19th century, the quiet coastal town of Darien, Georgia, sat deep within a system designed to deny black Americans both safety and justice. In that world, an accusation alone could decide a man's fate long before any courtroom was reached. Across the South, similar moments followed a familiar pattern. A rumor spread, a crowd gathered, and by morning another life was lost without trial or accountability. Fear was meant to move faster than reason, and most of the time, it did. When Henry Delegal, a respected black landowner, was accused of a crime in the summer of 1899, everyone in Darien understood what usually followed. History had already taught them the cost of waiting for protection that rarely arrived. They had seen too many names reduced to brief notices in newspapers, too many families left to mourn in silence. This time, however, something different took hold within the black community of the town. Instead of retreating behind closed doors, men spoke quietly to one another, weighed the danger, and reached a shared conclusion. If they remained passive, the outcome was almost certain. If they stood together, there was at least a chance to change it. As night approached, word spread that a white crowd intended to seize Delegal from the jail before dawn. Black men began to gather, some bringing rifles and shotguns they had owned for years, others carrying the steady confidence of men who knew their streets and neighbors well. They positioned themselves carefully, not in anger, but with purpose, controlling light and space, prepared for the possibility that fear would arrive in human form. The message was not shouted, yet it was unmistakable. This would not be easy. This would not be silent. When the crowd approached, they encountered something they had not expected, resistance that did not scatter. The sight of armed black men holding their ground forced hesitation, and hesitation changed everything. The moment stretched, heavy and uncertain, until the crowd began to pull back. What had been assumed to be another effortless act of terror suddenly carried risk. That single shift altered the course of the night and, more importantly, the fate of one man. Authorities soon realized that the situation could no longer be ignored. State forces were sent in, not to reward the community's courage, but to reassert control and make clear that such defiance would not be encouraged. Homes were searched, arrests followed, and the pressure to restore order fell hardest on those who had dared to protect one of their own. Yet even under scrutiny and intimidation, something irreversible had already happened. Henry Delegal was still alive. He was not taken under cover of darkness. He would stand before a jury rather than a mob. That distinction mattered. When Deligal's case finally reached the courtroom, it unfolded in full public view, with evidence examined and testimony heard. Against the expectations of the era, the jury returned an acquittal. It was not a sweeping victory, nor did it erase the danger that followed. The state still demanded accountability elsewhere, and the community paid a price for its stand. But the central truth remained. Collective resolve had interrupted a system that depended on fear moving unchallenged. The events in Darien echoed far beyond that single night. In the years that followed, the region recorded fewer acts of racial terror than many surrounding areas, a quiet indication that intimidation had lost some of its certainty. What happened there did not dismantle injustice, but it exposed its weakness. It showed that fear, when confronted with unity and determination, could falter. In Darien, a community refused to accept the ending that history seemed to offer, and by doing so, they opened the door to a different outcome that would resonate in later struggles across the South. Nearly half a century after Darien, the pattern of intimidation had not disappeared, but the people confronting it had changed. The Second World War had ended, and black men were returning home after serving in uniform across Europe and the Pacific. They had faced danger abroad, learned discipline under pressure, and carried with them a sharpened awareness of what organized power looked like. When they came back to the American South, many expected hardship, but fewer were willing to accept humiliation as inevitable. In Columbia, Tennessee, that shift in mindset would collide with an old order that refused to loosen its grip. The spark came from an incident so ordinary it barely seemed worth remembering at first. A young black Navy veteran named James Stevenson accompanied his mother to a local store to retrieve a radio they had paid to have repaired. The exchange turned tense, then physical, and within hours the story was being retold in ways that stripped it of context and loaded it with anger. By nightfall, rumors had hardened into outrage, and a white crowd began to gather with the familiar expectation that intimidation would once again run its course without resistance. But Columbia in 1946 was not the Columbia of an earlier generation. In the black business district known as Mink Slide, men who had worn military uniforms understood exactly what it meant when crowds formed and voices rose. They had seen what hesitation cost on battlefields overseas, and they recognized the warning signs now unfolding at home. Quietly and efficiently, they organized. So, positions were chosen, lights were removed to deny advantage. Each man knew his role, not out of recklessness, but from a shared determination that their neighborhood would not be overrun. As the night deepened, tension pressed in from all sides. The crowd near the courthouse grew louder, more confident in its numbers, while the streets of Mink Slide settled into an uneasy stillness. When police officers entered the district to test its defenses, the confrontation that followed shattered long-held assumptions. The officers retreated under fire, their vehicles damaged, their authority challenged in a way rarely seen in the South. For the first time in living memory, a black community had organized a defense that could not be brushed aside as symbolic or weak. The reaction was swift and severe. State forces poured into Columbia, surrounding the district, searching homes, and arresting residents in large numbers. 2 veterans died while in custody, deepening the sense of injustice that already hung over the town. Yet even amid the crackdown, something fundamental had shifted. The narrative was no longer one of helplessness. The events drew national attention, forcing journalists, SEMT classes, lawyers, and civil rights organizations to look closely at what had happened and why. When the cases reached court, the outcome surprised many observers. With the support of skilled legal defense and public scrutiny, most of the men charged were acquitted, and the remaining convictions were later overturned. The verdicts did more than free individuals. They sent a signal that the old methods of intimidation no longer guaranteed control. What had begun as an attempt to enforce silence instead exposed the fragility of a system that depended on unchecked fear. Columbia became known not simply as a confrontation, but as a turning point. It marked the moment when post-war black resistance took on a new confidence, shaped by military experience and collective discipline. The men of Mink Slide had not set out to make history. They acted because the alternative was submission to a pattern they knew too well. In doing so, They demonstrated that organized self-defense could alter outcomes far beyond a single night, influencing courtrooms, customs and cuisines, public opinion, and the future strategies of those who would continue the struggle for dignity and equal treatment in the years ahead. By the time the struggle reached Monroe, North Carolina in the 1950s, the lessons of earlier confrontations had not been forgotten. Darien had shown that unity could interrupt terror, and Columbia had revealed how discipline and experience could force the nation to pay attention. Monroe became the next chapter in that evolving story, a place where the balance of fear shifted decisively and stayed that way. At the center of it stood Robert F. Williams, a man shaped by both memory and resolve, who refused to accept that intimidation was the natural order of life. Monroe was a small town, but the pressure on its black residents was relentless. Night after night, caravans of white supremacists drove through black neighborhoods, firing shots into the air, leaving burning symbols behind, and making sure everyone knew they could return whenever they wished. Local authorities rarely intervened, and at times seemed more interested in preserving appearances than protecting people. For many families, sleep became difficult, not because danger was constant, but because it was unpredictable. Fear thrived in that uncertainty. Williams understood that fear well. As a child, he had witnessed acts of cruelty that left lasting impressions, and military service had taught him that preparation and coordination mattered. When he became president of the local NAACP chapter, he rejected the idea that dignity required passivity. He believed deeply in justice, but he also believed that justice without protection was fragile. If the law could not guarantee safety, then the community would have to provide it for itself. The response he helped organize was neither chaotic nor secretive. Under the cover of legitimacy, Williams and other men, many of them veterans, formed what became known as the Black Armed Guard. Officially, it appeared as a rifle club, but its purpose was clear to those involved. They trained, communicated, and agreed on rules that emphasized restraint and responsibility. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but deterrence. They wanted the harassment to stop, and they understood that consistency was the only language intimidation respected. The first true test came when threats escalated around a funeral for a black man whose life had already been taken by injustice. Rumors spread that the ceremony itself would be disrupted as a warning to the community. This time, when a line of vehicles approached under the cover of darkness, they were met with a sight they did not expect. Calm, organized men stood ready, their presence unmistakable. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The vehicles turned away, and the night passed without incident. It was a quiet victory, but one that carried weight. That lesson lingered, but it did not end the pressure. In October 1957, another attempt was made to intimidate a black neighborhood, this time aimed at the home of a local leader. Williams and the Guard had advance warning. They prepared carefully, choosing positions that favored visibility and control rather than chaos. When the convoy arrived, the defenders revealed themselves in a coordinated moment that shattered the attackers' confidence. The encounter was brief, but its effect was lasting. The message traveled faster than any official decree. Monroe was no longer an easy target. In the aftermath, something remarkable happened. Town officials, faced with undeniable reality, enacted measures that restricted the very tactics that had terrorized black residents for years. The night rides stopped. The harassment faded. Families who had lived under constant tension experienced a sense of normalcy that had once seemed unreachable. Monroe did not become a utopia, but it became livable in ways it had not been before. Williams' stance was controversial, even among allies, and it came at personal cost. Yet the results in Monroe could not be dismissed. Sustained terror had been ended not by promises or patience alone, but by organized, disciplined self-defense rooted in community responsibility. The story of Monroe carried forward the same truth glimpsed in earlier struggles. Fear loses its power when it no longer goes unanswered, and when people stand together with clarity and resolve, even deeply entrenched intimidation can be forced to retreat. By the mid-1960s, the struggle had entered a new and more volatile phase. The lessons of Darien, Columbia, and Monroe had spread quietly through black communities across the South. carried by word of mouth and shared experience rather than official recognition. Non-violent marches and voter registration drives were gaining visibility, but so too was the backlash they provoked. In many towns, civil rights workers faced nightly harassment, threats, and ambushes, often with little confidence that local authorities would intervene. It was within this dangerous gap between protest and protection that the Deacons for Defense and Justice emerged. The Deacons were not born from ideology alone, but from exhaustion. Many of the men who formed the first chapter in Jonesboro, Louisiana in 1964 were military veterans who had seen the cost of disorganization under pressure. They watched as neighbors were intimidated for attempting to vote or attend meetings, and as visiting organizers were targeted simply for showing up. Waiting had brought no relief. Quiet endurance had changed nothing. The decision to act came not as a declaration, but as a commitment to responsibility. If people were going to risk their lives for equal treatment, someone had to make sure they made it home alive. Unlike earlier efforts that operated in the shadows, the Deacons chose visibility. They carried weapons openly and moved through their communities without disguise, sending a message that protection was not something to be ashamed of or hidden. Discipline was central to their identity. Members followed strict rules, coordinated movements, leveled, and avoided unnecessary confrontation. Their presence was deliberate and measured, designed to discourage attacks before they began rather than escalate them once underway. As chapters spread across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, the impact became impossible to ignore. In towns where intimidation had once been routine, night riders began to disappear. The sudden certainty of consequence altered behavior in ways speeches alone could not. In Bogalusa, Louisiana, a place known for entrenched resistance to integration, the Deacons escorted civil rights leaders through hostile streets and stood guard during marches that might otherwise have ended in chaos. Their calm, steady presence changed the atmosphere, not by provoking fear, but by neutralizing it. One of the most telling moments came during a tense march when a crowd pressed in on demonstrators, emboldened by numbers and anger. As the situation edged toward disaster, a single, controlled response made clear that the line would not be crossed. Panic replaced confidence, and the crowd scattered. The march continued. Lives were preserved. The message echoed far beyond that day. Intimidation no longer guaranteed submission. The effect of the Deacons' work reached beyond local streets. Federal authorities, long hesitant to intervene in small-town violence, were forced to confront the possibility of open conflict if protection was not provided. In Bogalusa, legal pressure compelled local law enforcement to do what it had long avoided, enforcing the law evenly rather than selectively. This shift did not come from moral appeals alone, but from the reality that communities had decided they would no longer remain exposed. Importantly, the Deacons did not see themselves as opponents of nonviolent protest. They understood that marches, sit-ins, and court cases required space to succeed. Their role was to hold that space when institutions failed to do so. Many leaders who publicly preached restraint privately acknowledged the necessity of their presence, recognizing that progress often depended on layers of effort working together. By the time the Deacons faded in the late 1960s, much had changed. Their existence was no longer as urgently required, and many chapters dissolved quietly. Yet their legacy endured. They demonstrated that organized, disciplined self-defense could coexist with broader movements for justice, and that protection was not a rejection of principle, but a means of preserving it. In the larger story of resistance, the Deacons stood as proof that courage sometimes wears a uniform of calm vigilance, ensuring that the path forward remains open when fear tries to close it. As the long struggle for dignity and equal rights moved deeper into the heart of the Deep South, the story reached a quiet but powerful turning point in Canton, Mississippi. By this time, communities had already learned hard lessons from Columbia, Monroe, and the towns protected by the Deacons for Defense and Justice. People understood that courage did not always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it stood calmly on a familiar street, visible enough to be understood, steady enough to change behavior without a single confrontation. In Canton, that courage took human form in CIO Chin, whose presence alone altered the balance of fear that had defined daily life for black families for generations. Canton was a place where intimidation had long worked because it was predictable and unchallenged. Civil rights organizers arrived knowing that voter registration efforts often failed not because of a lack of desire, but because of the quiet pressure applied after sunset, when threats felt closer and help felt far away. CIO Chin understood this reality intimately. He did not speak in slogans or speeches, and he did not seek recognition. Instead, he made it clear through his actions that those who came to help the community would not stand alone. His resolve sent a message that echoed through the town, carried not by rumors, but by consistency. When people saw him standing watch, they understood that someone was paying attention. That intimidation would no longer go unanswered. What made Canton different was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow shift in confidence. Volunteers who once hesitated began to stay longer. Local residents who had watched from a distance stepped forward to register, to attend meetings, and to believe that participation no longer meant isolation. The power of white supremacist groups depended heavily on the assumption that fear would always win, that resistance would crumble under pressure. In Canton, that assumption weakened. The presence of one determined individual disrupted a system that relied on silence and withdrawal. This final chapter ties together everything that came before, from returning veterans in Tennessee, to organized community defense in North Carolina, to the disciplined protection offered by the deacons. The pattern is clear. Change did not come from chaos or revenge, but from unity, discipline, and a refusal to surrender basic human rights. Canton shows us that history is not only shaped by large movements, but also by individuals who understand their responsibility to the people around them. CIO Chin's role reminds us that bravery does not always need a crowd, only conviction. As the civil rights movement moved forward, the lessons from places like Canton traveled with it. They reshaped strategies, strengthened communities, and forced the nation to confront the reality that progress was being earned not just through speeches and laws, but through everyday acts of protection and resolve. The power of these stories lies in their humanity. They are not tales of hatred, but of people choosing to stand firm so others could step forward. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on a chapter of history that still matters today. If you found this journey meaningful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who want to understand how courage, unity, and quiet strength helped shape a better future.